So thank you for being with us. This is the fifth event in the series. There are 3 more coming this upcoming week. And I want to thank our sponsors, the College of Architecture, Arts and Humanities, the Humanities Hub, the World Cinema Program, as well as a number of departments who have helped us, the Department of English, the Department of History and Geography, and the Department of Languages. I also extend a thank you to the Clemson libraries. They have funded some of our permissions and purchased some of the titles in the film series. So thank you to everyone who have contributed to supporting this important series of events. And without further ado, I want to quickly introduce my next speaker, Professor Lee Morrissey, who happens to be a mentor and professor to our guest keynote speaker today, Will Cathcart. Lee is a professor in the English department. He professes, let's see if I can remember as a film studies scholar what Lee professes. I believe he's an expert on Milton, that guy, and the 18th century. He also happens to be the founding director of the Humanities Hub. Lee, the floor is yours.
Morning, everyone, and thanks for being here. Welcome to those here and at home or remote locations. Thanks, Jonathan, for helping to set this up and for getting me involved. I do appreciate the chance to reconnect with Will. I am here to introduce Will Cathcart, our speaker today, and we'll do that in a second. Just a quick note about format for those who want to sign up for credit. Sheet is in the back where Aga is waving her hand. I'll introduce, Will speak, then there'll be questions and answers. If you feel like you need to leave, the moment between the speaking and the question and answers is usually the best time to do it. However, it's usually in the question and answers that things get really interesting. And if you know Will, they could get very interesting. You might want to not leave before the Q&A. So for those of you who don't know Will, which may be a small number in this audience in the room, he's a Clemson alum, class of 2005, and I think there are 4 things to know about him for today's talk, 3 from his time as undergraduate here at Clemson, and I say these in part to introduce Will, and in part in case there are students in the audience who think about the kind of career that Will has had. First thing to know about Will as an undergraduate is that he threw himself into everything, including studying abroad, taking on, in other words, another language, joining the Clemson Players, and trotting the stage in theatrical productions, including one which, to go back to point number 1, went abroad to the Fringe Festival in Edinburgh. And the third, and I think most important thing for today's talk to know, and a transition into his future life, is that, well, in 2005, when he was a senior, I believe it was, Salvador Plasencia published a novel called The People of Paper. Really a novel about Will's tribe. Will is a person of paper. When he was an undergraduate at Clemson, on a calm day, you could probably find him by following an actual paper trail because he was always writing. Many times when I had a class with Will in it, I would be cleaning up the board, packing up my books, and Will would return to scoop up the pages that were on the floor behind him. And that matters for today's talk because Will was already a writer. He is a writer because he was a writer, and he was practicing all the time. The fourth and final thing I'd like to tell you about Will is, and this is going to sound like a spy novel, I don't mean it that way, but there may be an element of that too. I had just arrived in Istanbul in 2008 when I got an email on the very day I landed from Will, who was then about 3 years out of college, kind of bouncing around. But he had come to the conclusion that Russia was about to invade Georgia. He was emailing me from the airport. He had contacted the president of Georgia, Saakashvili at the time, telling him that he was a journalist from Charleston and he wanted to interview him. And he was boarding the plane when he sent me the email. In a way, Will has never left. Georgia, that is. The interview with Saakashvili went very well. It turns out it was a mutual interview. He interviewed Saakashvili, Saakashvili interviewed him, and he got a job as Saakashvili's media consultant and stayed in Georgia. When Will, as you may know, went into and came out of Ukraine not long ago, as he's reported on in multiple sources, I wrote to him and asked if he felt like he was in 1936, i.e. in the Spanish Civil War. And he said, absolutely. And now that I look back on it, now that we get more perspective on what's happening in Ukraine, I feel like 1936 may have been unfolding for a long time, that it wasn't just in February. And in a way, the person I know who most foresaw that 1936 is Will, with his decision to get on a plane in 2008. Because it's given him this perspective from over there on what's happening and what has been happening since at least 2008. I look forward to what he has to say today. Thanks. Will?
Can everybody hear me? Man, I'm very moved, Dr. Morrissey. So I had a remarkable college experience. I have 3 mentors in this room: Dr. Morrissey, Keith Morris, and Mike LeMahieu. Yeah, these guys changed my life and made sure I graduated. At the time, Keith is a writer, Mike is a scholar, Lee Morrissey's he specializes in literary criticism as well. So I was going to add that to the list when they're talking, and that's what I remember most from his classes. At one time, I had published all this stuff in semantics. Is semantics still going? And I was like, yeah, Doc, what do you think of all that? And he was like, Will, sometimes less is more. And it's always stuck with me because he's right. I was just writing constantly. And so, I tried to sort of maybe become my own critic a little more and editor. And those words have stayed with me. And it's a pleasure to be here. Kind of moving to see these guys, these professors. Let's see. I don't know how to pay it back, the time these guys gave me. And I guess for any students here, what I would say is make sure that when you have a class, you go up to the professor afterwards and you talk to them, because that will change your life. Here at Clemson, people are, professors are so nice. Next thing you know, they'll be your best friends, and it's pretty wild. But also, I want to apologize for not stripping down naked and jumping in the reflecting pool like James Dickey did when he was here. I'm not James Dickey, sorry guys. But I did get to spend a night in Clemson last night, and it was so great. I felt like I was home. It's strange, being home here in South Carolina. I've started writing down things that I say to my 3-year-old here in the South. Stuff like, "That's not your coyote. Stop hitting it with the shovel. Know that ambulance is not going to arrest you." He's from Georgia. He thinks the ambulances are going to arrest him. I don't know. And "No, you may not enter the neighbor's garage to play on their golf cart. You remember what happened last time? They might get angry. They probably have guns, and kid, you're a foreigner here." For a guy who is always late, I think I was almost late today. If not, this is the only thing I was ever on time for my entire time at Clemson. I have tragic punctuality when it comes to Russian invasions. This led me, as Doc said, to Georgia in 2008, Ukraine's Maidan Revolution in 2014, right before a sniper fired, and I learned a lot from that day, but I'll get there. Also to Odessa and Mariupol in 2015, and then back to Odessa, and then a long train to Mariupol for Putin's latest rendition of human atrocity. For some reason, y'all think that my blundering into a war zone, being shot at and frozen, gives me license to address you about what may be a coming world war. But hey, being a writer's never been healthy, and maybe this is a new low, but I'm here, and so that's what I want to talk about today. A lot of people ask me, well, the other thing is also only in South Carolina do people come up and ask me how they can contribute to the war effort, and they make it clear they don't want to contribute to Ukrainian refugees. They want their money to go kill Russians. They want their funds to do it, and it's pretty wild. And yeah, a lot of people ask me why I went there, and the answer is pretty simple. This time, after watching Ukrainians just burn Maidan Square to the ground, take sniper fire for months out in the cold freeze, they were getting hosed and everything. They overthrew their government, and then they resisted invasion from Russia for 8 years. I knew these men and women were not going to back down, come hell or high water, whatever was going to happen. And in the face of an invasion that seemed both imminent and impossible. And that's something that has kind of baffled all of us. Like we knew it was happening, and that's why I headed there. At the same time, what we're seeing now seemed impossible. It is truly a different world. I was talking to Doc, and I teach a class in Georgia, and it's a workshop about journalism. And as Doc said, the entire world is kind of right now facing a literary workshop about Ukraine and about foreign policy. This is new to all of us. One of the most seasoned reporters I know, Michael Schmidt with the New York Times, he wrote me just saying, like, I'm just trying to figure it out. This is new, for even for him, because we have a war in Europe. We're in an age of social media. So many things are different, and that means it can also escalate in a way that we're all very worried about. But so I went to Ukraine to cover something that for me was quite evident, and to deliver a message that if that invasion were to happen, it would be warfare on a scale and magnitude of brutality that the world has not seen in a long time. And I guess I became the recipient of my own message, and I nearly killed the messenger. What blows my mind isn't so much Putin's inability to understand this message, but his refusal to accept it. And if things don't stop, then several years from now, Ukrainians will be driving around in Toyota Helixes with Russian heads mounted on the front. Nobody's going to watch that on CNN, but they will still be fighting. It will get incredibly brutal. And that's what's really hard. It's amazing seeing the courage of these fighters, and yet the brutality sometimes isn't shown. And that's something that I want to convey today, that is hard. At the same time, we do need people to pay attention. So I understand why. But so my photographer, Robert Cooper, and I were still in Mariupol when Russia invaded Ukraine. It's been invading since 2014, but for this latest invasion, the big one. We headed west as fast as we could, and that drove us straight into the Kherson offensive, which is one of the first clashes since Russia tried to take Ukraine earlier that morning. At this stage, Russia was making massive land grabs. Troops from Crimea had come north to seize a nearby airport and a bridge. At the time, we didn't realize that's what was happening, but we quickly learned. The attack began at an overpass on the P-47 highway at 3 p.m. on February 24th. Russian forces attacked a vast line of Ukrainian tanks, transport vehicles, and personnel carriers from two directions. We had driven up beside it, and we quickly realized we were in the wrong place. When a tank we passed was hit by a rocket-propelled grenade, we ditched our car. We ran from one place to another. I was carrying this massive bag, only to be turned back by rockets and artillery. So eventually we just jumped in the bed of an old Soviet transport truck, and we cowered there in the tires while bullets are whizzing by above, and we're hearing rockets go off. As the explosions grew closer, we pulled out our phones and recorded videos saying what was happening, and also saying goodbye to our 2-year-old sons and our families. We thought it was going to be like that. When I watch this video now, I'm overcome with shame. and loathing at the person who put himself in this position, especially as a father. But yeah. In front of us from there was this dilapidated concrete structure, and we ran for it, we crawled beneath, and we hid in the dirt like rodents. A truck driver and a farmer followed us. There were no windows, no blankets, but the farmer returned with a moldy bed lining and a dinner of pickled tomatoes, vodka, and apples. And though magnificent flames reached into the sky around us in every direction, there would be no fire for us that night. We were 100 kilometers north of Crimea, which Putin invaded and annexed in 2014, many of you know. And we cowered under a cacophony of vintage 20th century weapons that the Ukrainians and Russians were using to kill each other, and still are. As artillery fire and rockets of various acronyms and millimeters rained down, we crouched in that shoddy concrete structure. Sometimes we hid beneath it, and we shivered like rats. For 18 hours, we watched the battle unfold around us on a map that indicated my phone location. Okay. The structure we were in barely even registered on the map. For my wife and some friends who were watching us, it looked like we were just sitting in the middle of a field watching a war, unfold around us. And we might as well have been. That night, Russia claimed to have taken Kherson. I'm very happy to say that today they no longer have control of Kherson. They're fighting there, but they don't have control. As jets began to pass overhead and bombs dropped nearby, I had the strange sensation of hoping that the fighter jets were Russian, because at the moment we were on Russian-held ground and we were less likely to be targets. I felt like a wet rat. I'd never been less human. What little glass remained in that place was just a constant state of vibration. From mortars, rockets, bombs, everything. The noise didn't stop. Rob, our driver, a guy named Vlad, who was in for more than he bargained for when he agreed to take us from Mariupol to Odessa. We spent the night freezing in that place and uploading and deleting photos and videos from our 14-hour embed the day before with a paramilitary team called Third Force, right out of Mariupol. They were responsible for the death of hundreds of Russian soldiers, FSB agents, and separatists. We had bonded with these men, and that was evident in the footage that we took, the videos, pictures, all that stuff. And had we been caught, we knew we would not be treated as journalists. Journalists aren't treated like journalists there. I've seen many have died. We feared for our lives, and we feared for the lives of these men if we were apprehended. So that morning, when Russia invaded, we booked it west as fast as we could, and that took us directly into Kherson. It was the longest and coldest night of my life. When I do sleep, I dream of dismembered, mutilated bodies of Russian soldiers we passed on the way out of that place, which the Ukrainians left out as a warning to the Russians who would soon return, and who did. Third Force, the guys that we embedded with, they're an almost mythic team of 15 fighters. Their commander goes by the name of Groz, as in Grozny. He knows that guerrilla warfare is a war of hearts and minds, and that is the first thing he said to us, and it's the last thing he said to us. Without a balaclava, he looks almost cuddly. He makes dirty jokes that aren't divisive, and he's funny. He's also a cold stone killer who's been trained as a sniper and who shows us videos of his boys killing people. In 2021, Ukraine had only 200 confirmed kills for the entire country that year. Roz and his 15 men killed 50 of those. 15 guys killed 25% of everyone that year. I'm sure they've exceeded that figure weeks ago. Roz recently sent me a video showing 2 Russian tanks they had taken out. On the previous night, one of his men had been wounded and shot in the liver, and everybody else was dead. Videos are brutal, hard to watch, but again, the message that these guys are sending and sent me told me that they're not going to back down. They're fighting for their families, their land, and Russia's fighting for almost nothing. And it's hard to see people die over that. They'd been at war for 8 years, fighting in the East, in the two territories that were Russia recognized as independent the day before we embedded. They showed us everything. They showed us dozens of kills using remotely detonated mines, loitering IEDs, and VR-operated drones dropping impact detonation fuses on FSB convoys. What struck me was how bright and red the blood of those men was on those videos that they showed me one after another, laughing. They revealed their methods, their tactics, their improvisation, their tech campaigns, their vast array of weapons, and an endless cache of mines. I have never seen so many explosives in one place, and I hope to never again. Earlier that day, they led us down a road between two minefields that Russian-backed separatists had left. And, we could see a swing set in the middle of this field, which was grown over, and there are mines in it. There were ominous warning signs posted along this road, and the signs seemed to tell a story of the brutality of human beings for some alien race in the future. As we walked, I looked down to check my notes, and Graz turned and yelled at me to stay on the road. There was genuine panic in his eyes. I'm kind of absent-minded, so I'm just walking and looking at my notes and picked the wrong step. And man, he was genuinely terrified because, again, we're on a minefield. So yeah, we reached a strikingly beautiful beach called on the Sea of Azov, where they gave us a demonstration of their drones. One of the younger soldiers popped on a VR headset, and Ross scanned the area with the thermal scope of his assault rifle. And that drone took off at 90 miles per hour towards the front line. We heard 2 bursts of gunfire, and the fighter on the VR headset started laughing because first the Ukrainians had fired at the drone, and then the Russians had. But AKs are not accurate rifles, and that drone came back unharmed. And we walked back to the base more carefully than we had ever walked in our lives. The only female member of the group was a gorgeous woman who goes by the name of Xenia, and she films their exploits for an immensely popular Telegram channel. It's called Third Force. It's written in Russian. I would encourage you to check it out. And it is hard to see. It's brutal stuff, but it's, the message is clear. And these are the messages that didn't get to Putin before and maybe still aren't. The fighters are large and fierce, but when they made jokes about their unit's mascot, which was a cat named Horse, they seem almost sweet, and we felt safe for those few hours leading up to the end of the world. I have not felt safe since. Now Graz and his men are insurgents defending one of the most dangerous places in Europe. That night at their base, we met Panda, the head of a Lithuanian NGO called Blue Yellow. We shared a meal of buckwheat and canned meat that Rob, my photographer, thought was for the cat named Horse. Panda of Blue Yellow delivers supplies to the front. And the work of Panda and Blue Yellow has become the stuff of legend for people there. For anybody who's interested in trying to help on the front lines, I think Blue Yellow is a great place to start. They're an NGO. They were supplying non-lethal things. Now they're supplying everything, but they're working directly with these fighters. And so, and that's one of the things that they wanted to talk to me about. One of the things why Raz risked giving away his position was to tell me that funding from the United States government doesn't really make it to its destination. It doesn't make it to them. And they don't cite the usual suspects like corruption and graft. They cite a much less interesting problem, which is inefficiency and a lack of practical understanding of what these fighters need. Inefficiency and redundancy, it puts a lot of people at risk. The US is coming at this on too large of a scale, they tell me. Additional efforts are needed, and Panda tries to fill that gap. Issues occur all over the supply chain, from policy level to distribution. For instance, troops are coming back to him looking for Javelin battery packs because the ones they have gone dead in the cold because they were being stored, in Iraq and Afghanistan. Or they have Javelins and Stingers piled up, but no way to transport them. And they need vehicles to launch these weapons from. So the US sends Humvees, but with no spare parts. These guys need Toyota pickups. It's great weapons are flowing in, but a new kind of thinking is necessary. And that's one of the things that I've been trying to talk about everywhere I go. Redundancy, as I said, puts strain on these precious supply lines, and it creates risks for everybody involved. The leftovers from other wars will not meet the needs of this one. Otherwise, Third Strike will just go back to dropping impact fuses on Russian convoys with $500 drones. We are the tactical Taliban, Roz tells me and grins. Despite extensive US training, soldiers in Ukraine and in Georgia, they pick up AK-47s when it's time to fight, instead of M4 carabines they've been trained with. They fight with what they know against an enemy who delivers ammunition to them one man at a time. In Ukraine, Panda says you have to think upside down. If you do things only through central command, you lose momentum. You need to work directly with the fighters to establish these supply lines. Blue Yellow since has set up a forward operating base 10 miles from the Polish border. Their operation has grown exponentially, but these problems still remain. He makes deliveries with armed escorts from the Ukrainian armed forces. Recently, they delivered 60 vehicles across the border. Sent me pictures. It was amazing to see. It was baffling. But the needs of foreign fighters on the ground are extremely specific. Kelso, we'll say that name, is an American with the Foreign Legion Command. He commands a dozen fighters from all over Europe. When I asked him what he needs, his response is alarmingly specific. We need 12 plates, 6 helmets, 6 night vision goggles, 6 thermal sights, 3 plate carriers, 3 compasses, 1 rifle, 1 long gun, 1 machine gun, 4 more rifles, 6 sidearms, ammo pouches, grenade pouches, smoke grenades, 6 assault packs, 6 trauma kits, 6 camel packs, 6 radios, and 6 infrared lasers. I should have just asked what he had. When Graz dropped us off that night at the hotel, he hugged us. He looked at me and he removed the signature patch of his battalion from his shoulder and he handed it to me. And then he was gone. I probably should have gotten rid of that, but I have it with me still. Several hours later, the big war began. We knew we wouldn't be treated as journalists. For Russians currently targeting civilian dwellings in Ukraine, the Geneva Conventions are just a punchline. The easy thing would have been to delete everything when we were trying to get away, but Roz went to great risk giving away his position and tactics for a reason. He was counting on us to tell his story. Roz wants the world to know that this fight will not be the fight Russia is expecting. These men are ready for all types of warfare. They are innovative, and there are many, many more like them. In seeking to put distance between ourselves and Mariupol, we drove straight into hell, and it's a hell that followed us both home and will probably drag me back there. The battle that night shifted to a nearby bridge, which Ukrainian forces were trying to take. The bridge was our only way out. All night, Russian jets bombed those forces who were struggling to take that bridge. Just before dawn, I received a message from an intelligence contact who had been checking in on us, and he said that Ukrainian forces had taken back the bridge, but he had no idea if it was safe to get there. With some help, we made a mad dash for that bridge. And as we drove onto the highway, we were witness to a charred wasteland. Bombed out, Ukrainian tanks were everywhere. The corpses of dead Russian soldiers were left out on display. As we got closer to that bridge, the scenery grew worse. We passed pieces of dead men. Near the top of the bridge, in the middle of the road, was the nude upper torso of a bifurcated human being. He had been left there as a warning to the Russians who were soon to come and who would take that bridge half an hour after we crossed it. We got very lucky. Our driver, Ivan, began to weep. At the bottom of the bridge, we were pulled over by a young sentry with a wild look in his eyes. He attempted to talk to Ivan while pointing his rifle at me. I knew I should have been more afraid and alert at that point, but everything had been dulled. I was still at rats, and in a way, the world was simpler. Russian forces took that bridge, as I said, half an hour after we crossed it. We headed west for Odessa, but we couldn't stay there either. Odessa is now part of a different world. We said goodbye to Ivan, who wept again, and hired another driver to take us to the Moldovan border. But the refugee crisis had begun, and that refugee crisis is a very deliberate thing. Putin is trying to weaponize refugees. And we have a Polish professor here now who can tell you that, in Poland and Hungary and a lot of these places, they are not crazy about refugees, but these places have let in millions. And that has been something that's pretty amazing to see, how all these allies have come together. And it's been surprising as well, because that's another tactic of Putin's, is to try to create division. That didn't happen, it hasn't happened yet. And I think we can credit Zelensky for a lot of that. Someone told me yesterday, he's not afraid to put people on the spot, and nobody wants to tell him no. Everybody wants to be the nice guy who gets to say yes to Zelensky, which is why we see sometimes conflicting messages from allies. So instead of exiting the normal way, we headed for the unrecognized state of Transnistria, a narrow Russian-backed Moldovan micronation along the Ukrainian border. Upon entry, we were detained by the Transnistrian KGB, as they still call themselves, and we were interrogated. They didn't know what to make of us. The suspicion turned into fascination and bafflement. They seemed to eventually conclude that we were insane, stupid, or both, and they weren't half wrong. Rob, my photographer, carries his camera in a bright yellow Pelican case that looks like it's a tactical case. It looks like something designed for a weapon. When they saw that, they were sure they had us. But when Rob opened up that case for them, inside he had a thin biography of Benjamin Franklin, and under that, a bottle of vodka nestled where his camera should have been, and they nodded in respect, because that's how they would carry their vodka too. Eventually, they let us go, and we crossed into Moldova. Our relief to be on EU territory was immeasurable, but Moldovan airspace was and is closed, and it would be days before we would get back home. It's been a long time since one man held the free world hostage with a delusional inferiority complex, but as Putin deprives 44 million people of their humanity and lives, and their allies of our honor, the least we can do is put his depravity on full display. People ask me how I ended up in the middle of a war with a guy from South Texas, colloquially known as Right Hand Rob. I told him I was headed to Ukraine in 2 days. He replied he would be on a plane out of Corpus Christi in the morning. No questions asked. Some people are just crazy. That morning in Mariupol, as the war broke out and we rushed to leave, Rob asked a journalist sitting outside of our hotel in Mariupol why he didn't seem concerned. And he said, well, I'm Indian. They don't care about me. You're an American. They catch you, they will put you up on a pole. I feel very prayed for, and I'm not sure how I feel about that. Because the people I left behind in places like Kiev, Odessa, and Mariupol, they need anti-tank mines, not prayers. Putin has already placed 2 intelligence chiefs on house arrest for not giving him an accurate picture of Ukrainian resolve. Soon he'll go after his defense minister. The Russian people still seem to support the war, but their army's falling apart. Leadership requires trust. And most of them were told they were headed to perform military exercises on the border, and now many won't come home alive. And eventually, those Russian mothers and grandmothers will realize this, and that is the message that will break through to them. There are reports of what we call mobile crematoriums. Putin began using these in Chechnya. The crematoriums are for his own troops. They look like tanks. He has these mobile crematoriums, and he is burning his own troops after they die so that bodies will not be sent home, and it won't create that photo, to avoid that media. But still, these mothers and grandmothers and families are going to know their son is there, and when he doesn't come home. Putin's problem is he assumes everyone else thinks as he does. I'm not really sure he's thinking at all lately, and Dmitry Medvedev, his former president, has been picking up the slack, spitting poison at the world. Putin, the once cool, calculated intelligence agent, seems driven by irrational anger. His arguments and justifications make very little sense, and they make far less sense coming from Medvedev. I'm not sure if he has an objective, just a God-sized void in him that makes him want to punish the world for his existence. He should be treated as he is, an unhinged terrorist with a nuclear arsenal, the largest nuclear arsenal on Earth. The good news is that Xi Jinping seems to also have come to this conclusion. Indeed, China is watching this conflict closely, as we all know, and 24-hour news coverage of Taiwanese farmers stealing Chinese tanks is probably among Xi's greatest fears. Taking Taiwan is meant to be China's debut as a global military power, and Ukraine has shown the world that this can result in humiliation. And that is a deterrent. Let's hope it will be the deterrent. I do not want Putin to be forgiven. I've spent 17 years of my life studying that dead-eyed bastard, and I do not want to understand. Putin wants to be remembered as the man who restored Russia to greatness, but he is destroying his dynasty. He's a Pete III at best. I pray he will die by a Ukrainian round. Or perhaps one day, Russian mothers of the boys he has sent to death will Gaddafi him in Lenin Square. Take that too, fine. But the greatest retribution will be condemning him to the ambiguous obscurity of his fellow crackpot dictators. As for the Russian men and women pulling triggers, pressing red buttons over there, missile systems rolling into Kiev and Mariupol, those who destroy entire apartment buildings, I pity them. I wish them long lives of remembering what they've done with no vodka in sight to blunt the memories. And may all their sons and daughters marry Ukrainians. For me, the situation has become pretty simple. Putin is using the largest nuclear stockpile on Earth to bully the free world into letting him lethally eliminate an entire country and its people. For this reason, he has forfeited his right to exist. Telling the Ukrainian people that they must choose neutrality like Finland as they are being slaughtered takes a special kind of audacity. It's not realism, it's cowardice. Others claim this war is America's fault. America is guilty of a great many things. This war isn't one of them. Claiming that America caused Russia to invade Ukraine is a dangerous kind of hubris. NATO expansion has created security for much of Eastern Europe. People don't like to talk about that. It's not a sexy headline. NATO could have provided security for both Ukraine and Georgia, but it failed in that endeavor, and it's time to fix that. Russia's entire history has been one of brutal, expansionist military campaign after military campaign. Had NATO not allowed new members to join after the collapse of the USSR, then what we are seeing today would be a far more common sight. America can't take credit for this war, but it can help stop it. It must help stop it. Many are taking this opportunity to criticize US leadership by saying if a different president were in office, things would be different. We have the president that we have, and no US president has faced a situation like this since the Cuban Missile Crisis. And make no mistake, we are averting nuclear war. I'm often told that Americans don't have an appetite to intervene in a military capacity. And I find great irony in that word appetite, because what I see in Russian people and their soldiers is a kind of ideological starvation that makes them do the most awful things out of fear. In failing to stop Putin's regime, we risk a similar kind of starvation. It's about more than the message we send to China. It's about the message that we tell our children about who we are, who they will be, whether we are people of courage or complacency. In 2008, when Russia invaded Georgia, the late Polish president Lech Kaczynski visited Tbilisi, and he said, "Today, Georgia, tomorrow, Ukraine, the day after tomorrow, the Baltic states, and then maybe it's time for my country, Poland." There's an image that has stuck with me for the past few weeks. Is it possible to get it up, Doc? Thank you. So in 2015, after Russia annexed Crimea, Ukrainian soldiers posed for a brilliant recreation of a painting of their ancestors. The painting is the reply of the Zaporizhian Cossacks by Ilya Repin. There you go. It wasn't in 2022, it was in 2015. It's, for me, it's just absolutely brilliant, and it says so much. In this painting, the Cossacks are telling the Ottoman Sultan to shove it, and a similar message to Putin is implied. It has become more than a joke. Those fighting on the front for their homeland create an image that counters Putin's very reason for invading them, the fiction that Ukraine and its people are a fiction. Putin would have done well to pay attention to this. Images like it show why the Ukrainians are fighting, why they've done so since 2014. It exhibits tenacity and the creative doggedness that allows resistance fighters to overcome astounding odds. And it portends an information war that has humiliated Putin and driven back Russian forces. An entire war is rarely caused by one man's ego, but this is Putin's greatest weakness. He represents nothing more than himself. He's only one man. That means one person can also make a difference. That means you can make a difference. For me, this painting is also a remarkable show of perspective and understanding of these soldiers' place in history, as well as the weakness of their enemy. In a single image, they are fundamentally denying Putin's claims against Ukrainian statehood. And they did this 7 years before Putin took Russia to a war to eliminate an entire country. Meanwhile, here in the US, several decades worth of art history degrees have been validated. If I were at Clemson, this is the type of thing that Doc probably would have pulled up, and we would have discussed this. We would have done a close reading of this painting and looked for what's in between the lines and what it means. It also shows that xenophobic idiots don't have a monopoly on nationalism. Leave it to Putin to inadvertently make Ukrainian nationalism heroic by attempting to use nationalism to deprive Ukraine of a nation. The very concept of nationalism has been poisoned by radical nationalists who confuse their belief in their nation with its supremacy. And finally, this image says a lot about the power of humor. If Ukrainians can get through this war without losing that innate sense of humor and perspective, then maybe they can avoid a cycle of violent retaliation that defines the history of places like Armenia and Azerbaijan. And Zelensky may be the only man in the world equipped for such an endeavor. There are still things I cannot come to terms with. That night in Kherson, while looking for water, I saw 24 Ukrainian soldiers in full battle gear emerge from the freight container of a semi-trailer truck that was parked in front of us. Russia had already taken the area. The soldiers weren't supposed to be there. They spoke in hushed voices. They were operating behind military lines, and meeting them still feels like a dream. Like a fool, I approached them in the darkness so directly that Ivan, our driver, had to jump in and explain who I was. Slava Ukraini, I said to each of them and shook their hands. I saw shame and bafflement. These guys had been separated from their unit earlier that day, and they had taken cover in the back of that truck. They seemed to get younger and younger the more I looked until I shook hands with two terrified children in uniform. Everything will be fine, I said to the youngest of them, and this was a lie. Then I watched them disappear in the darkness following the railroad. Later, I heard explosions and gunfire in the direction from which they had gone, and I attributed this to them. I hoped it was sabotage, but I have no way of knowing. It was wishful thinking, perhaps, but I needed to believe that someone out there was fighting, that someone out there was brave, and sometimes a thing doesn't have to be true. That morning when I woke Yvonne to leave, he told us that those soldiers had come back and spent the night in the factory next door to us. I felt an irreverent rage, realizing that we would have been killed had their position been given away. We had nearly died, separating ourselves from Ukrainian forces, and they had crept in and slept beside us. And when two of them offered to go check if the way to the bridge was clear, they risked their lives to go check that bridge. I felt shame again. There is so much shame in survival, in making assumptions about the silhouettes of men in uniform, friend or foe, dead or alive, hero or coward. The binaries lapse. I realize now that all things are true, and there's shame in knowing that too. Part of me is still waiting for the other shoe to drop, as if we avoided a tragedy we were not meant to survive. Many Georgians are fighting in Ukraine. At least 4 have been killed, as of the latest reports. Georgian men like to say that Slavic women love them, especially Ukrainians. When Putin invaded Ukraine, a great many Georgians immediately joined that fight. Putin needs to know that if you bomb someone's mother or sister, they will fight you. But if you bomb their mistress, they will defeat you. The West would do well to regard Georgia's relationship with Putin. For a decade, Georgia's ruling party has positioned itself as the sole party that's able to avoid consequences from the Kremlin. The problem is that their mandate is inextricably linked to Putin's power projection. It's a toxic relationship where the confirmation of a threat supersedes its elimination. The larger the threat from Russia, the more powerful the Georgian government that avoids its wrath. The lack of conflict in Georgia seems to confer the success of their leadership. The unlikely emergence of a figure like Zelensky disrupts this dynamic. A viable alternative to quiet capitulation threatens the Georgian government more than the enemy to which it has grown accustomed. If resistance is not futile, then why not resist? This is why the Georgian leadership makes no secret of its hatred towards the Ukrainian president, though rationally it cannot explain why. And everyone I ask denies it, but it's evident. For 25 years, the West has been reacting to Vladimir Putin. Attempts to alter this dynamic, such as Biden's successive announcements of an imminent invasion, making intelligence public, were great, but ultimately that failed. It didn't stop a war. Putin has managed to be a problem without becoming an enemy to the United States. But he is crystal clear in his designation of the United States as Russia's #1 existential enemy. And that's more than just rhetoric. Putin is correct that the West does not take Russia seriously. At most, Russia is an occasional adversary, unworthy of engagement of an enemy as an enemy force. Because of its innate military supremacy and ethical obligations, as sole superpower, the U.S. believes that it must check its might and impose restraints upon itself and restrain its reactions to ensure they are commiserate. And this allows Putin to dictate the rules of engagement, to monopolize escalation, to draw the line and then decide when to cross it. Civilians are dying in Ukraine because of American ignorance. It's been a long time since the U.S. had a hostile military adversary, and it requires coming to terms with the limits of American power. It requires relying on allies as well as defending them. It's time for the United States to give Russia what it wants, its full attention. This does not mean the start of a world war, though it may be the only way to prevent one. I find it interesting that NATO countries are self-imposing constraints based on their interpretations of Putin's actions and what they fear he might do. We've got it backwards. This allows Putin to dictate rules of engagement, monopolize escalation, as I said. It also leaves Western forces in a reactionary role, where they're qualifying Russian attacks on civilians, and that's no way to fight a war. It's certainly no way to end one. It reminds me of an abused spouse. Putin's not healthy. He's not in control. It's not his fault. This time it will be different. Don't call the police. Don't provoke him. I'm afraid for the children. Don't escalate the conflict. He's capable of horrible things. Recently, a friend asked me if Rob and I snuggled in that house to stay warm, and oh yeah, we did. Rob's not really my type. He's 6 foot, 200 pounds, and a bit high strung. And I'm not really his type either, I guess. He, before he met his lovely partner, dated a lot of people from South Texas for the local media stations. When we had gotten out of there and into Moldova, a newscaster Rob knew from South Texas called him to ask us questions about what we had just been through. We were so elated to be alive, we didn't make a lot of sense. I think I toasted her with the vodka bottle Rob had that may have saved us from the Transnistrian KGB. I asked the Moldovan guy who was driving, "Is this Europe? Can we drink in the car?" And I still don't know the answer because I did. All the while, we were on live local news in a live interview with a news station in Corpus Christi, Texas. Later, when we caught the segment, one of Rob's buddies recorded, it ended like this. Last we heard, Cooper and the New York Times journalist with him remain unharmed. They have crossed into Russian territory where they remain at large. As if we'd gone rogue. They didn't know where Moldova was or what Transnistria was, despite my repeated attempts to explain, albeit while howling out the window. I was glad to be alive. At one point, I think I yelled, "Take that, New York Times," because they had not run an op-ed and they thought I was. I suppose our manic account of exiting Ukraine through a Russian-occupied microstate, smaller than Delaware, with a third of its population, there caused a little communication issue. Presumably, since Rob is a Texan and I'm from a city and a state that starts civil wars, they thought we were headed north to Russia to kick some ass. We weren't. I kept expecting Rob to fly off the handle at me and say, "What have you gotten me into?" He never did. The only conflict Rob and I had was when we were rushing to catch a fateful train from Odessa to Mariupol. Odessa's the greatest city on earth. It's my favorite city. I don't know what will be left of it after this. It has a Georgian restaurant called Give to Me. Give is a Georgian name, and of course, Putin wants to destroy it. With about 10 minutes to go before rushing to the train station, we sat down before a massive spread of khinkali. These are Georgian dumplings. It's a hangover cure. We had left our mark on Odessa, and we were feeling it. Even if you aren't in a rush, Georgian dumplings are the loudest and messiest food you can eat. I was in an Anthony Bourdain episode, and they filmed me biting into one and slurping, and it's so embarrassing. But I was about to bite and slurp into one of these when Rob said, "Will, there's something I need to tell you. I'm not trying to be rude. This isn't personal, but I've got an awful case of misophonia, triggered by the sound of eating, and I see what's about to happen between you and those dumplings." I looked at Rob for a while and I said, "Yeah, okay, maybe you should wait outside." And he did, and we got on just fine after that. I think the worst moment of the experience for Rob is when we were snuggled up, shivering beneath this moldy, wet bed liner, freezing. And while I tried to type, he tried to sleep. At that point, I was so worried about frostbite on my toes, I had my feet shoved in Rob's armpits. And when Russian MiGs began buzzing over and dropping bombs, it shook the frame of that concrete place. Rob asked me for something to knock him out. In this massive bag, medicine I have to carry around for health reasons, and lugging around everywhere. And there's a time for self-medication. If there's a time for self-medication, this surely was it. But I needed the opposite. We all have our ways of escape. For me, escape was to remain awake, writing much of what you're hearing now. I was afraid to open my laptop for fear that the glow of it would attract snipers. So I typed it all on my phone and I prayed for battery life. When Rob accidentally knocked over the cup in which I plopped my last soluble caffeine and electrolyte painkiller tablets with the last of our water, it sure woke me up. Days and entire countries passed before I could allow myself to sleep. When we were out of water and vodka, I dug into that bag of apples the farmer had given us. And I'm wrong. I was wrong about Kinkali, Georgian dumplings. They're not the loudest food you can eat. Apples are. And as I chomped into that apple, I could feel Rob shiver between my toes. Drove him crazy. But that's how I knew he was okay. I'm sorry, Rob, I said. It's okay, man. This is so bad. When's it going to stop? The bombs or the apples, I said. Both, man, both. So I stopped eating the apples. After that, on account of my brother in arms and toes. Perhaps because Rob wasn't blaming me for our situation, I felt responsible for him and for our driver, Yvonne. I didn't feel so bad for the obese farmer in the corner who was snoring so loud I thought he would give away our position. I found myself wondering if it counts as murder if you suffocate somebody during a war to save yourself. Is that self-defense? I don't know. Every few minutes I had to throw a stick in his direction or some piece of debris from the floor of that place, if you can call it a floor or a place. I Googled how to say, "Stop snoring, the Russians will hear you," in 3 languages. None of them worked. When the relentless vibrations of bombs and mortars seemed to be growing closer, when it seemed like it could not get much colder or much worse, it did. I remembered the Finnish cross-country skier who froze his penis at the Olympics 2 days before. Rob was asleep, so I wrote my friend Ted, who also went to Clemson, asking if the Finnish guy recovered. "Will, that guy probably has a big one, so you don't need to worry," Ted said to me. And, you know, it takes a special kind of friend to talk shit to you when it might be your final moments on earth. As Rob shivered between my feet, I began to have thoughts I'm not proud of. As I said, I felt responsible for these guys, and I'm not a healthy person. But what I haven't said is that I'm a coward. I asked Ted what would happen if we surrendered. If I walked up to the Russian tank, I could see out the window, blocking the road, and just surrendered. He said, "Dude, if they Google you, the first thing that comes up is a CNN article telling people to spike Putin by visiting Georgia. That ain't an option for you, buddy." I didn't feel like there were many options left. But just before dawn, the sky turned blue and everything went quiet. It felt like a moment of grace, and I knew it was time to go. Shortly after, I received the message that the Ukrainians had taken back that bridge, and so we left. I do not know what became of the snoring farmer in the corner. He might still be there, frozen in his sleep and mid-snore. Seeing Ukrainian soldiers die for an idea and Russians die for the lack of one, I can tell you that Vladimir Putin's power is a frail thing. It is maintained by a facade of lies that will crumble when the truth surfaces. But it is a brutal truth that is much easier denied. And yet truth is like gravity, it always prevails. But there is another truth that must be faced, the truth of the story that we tell ourselves as Americans about who we are. It is the story that I tell my son about who he is. Just as my father told me and his father told him, the story explains why Ukrainian soldiers and civilians are fighting a power far larger than themselves. It explains why grandmothers are screaming in the streets, berating Russian soldiers who occupy their towns, and why they no longer even flinch when those soldiers fire assault rifles into the sky in futile attempts to intimidate them. It is why we see shame in the eyes of Russian captives and a look in the eyes of those grandmothers that is the stuff of lions. Now is the time when each of us, no matter how far away, must choose on which side we stand. Putin or the Ukrainian grandmothers. Sorry about the binary. Now is the time to follow our hearts and remember who we are. If we do, each of us will find a way to make a difference. That's the story I tell my son, the story of who he is. A small army of Ukrainian soldiers has shown the world that Putin's forces can be driven back, that there's an alternative to capitulation. Hope lies in this. Ukraine has sent a message to those who enjoy freedom and democracy all over the world, but the fight is not over and it's not even close. A different kind of war begins, and we must think differently. This requires innovation, endurance, and copious resources. Eventually, the news cycles will tire, but these men and women will not. In saving those whose freedom is threatened, we also save ourselves. If you would like to donate to any of these units, I've set up a fund on a page called Ko-fi, and you can find that on my Facebook page. Thank you for your time. Do a Q&A session, I guess. All right.
Wonder,
Any
Mike.
questions? Right here. Everybody takes class.
Hey, thank you for that. I'm sorry more people didn't get to hear it.
It's okay. I think it was on Zoom.
Okay, good.
Thanks.
Okay, yeah, it was very beautifully presented, and I think it's a message that more people in this country need to hear. But I have a question. So one of the things I'm trying to figure out is, how is it, say, because the Ukrainians are ex-Soviets like the Russians.
Mhm.
One of the problems with the Russian army is the extensive corruption. Okay. And, Ukraine has problems with that too. And so and I understand they're being invaded and they're protecting their homeland, but what I can't quite figure out is, how did their army become so good, separate from that, between 2014 and now, given what I just said?
It's a fantastic question. And what happened before 2014 is that Ukraine's last dictator, Yanukovych, started dismantling the Ukrainian army piece by piece. And he did this very gradually. And so by the time Putin took Crimea, and it was a matter of days without firing a shot. Later, fights broke out. Since then, Ukraine started revamping its military in a very smart way. You can go on and Google Ukrainian draft videos. It just goes through a list of people fighting, and they say, I'm a mother, I'm a mailman, I'm whatever, and they're all fighting. So Zelensky and, I'd say leadership before him really has gone to great efforts to modernize that army. And they've done it in a very pragmatic way that doesn't necessarily, they're using that money very well. So, I'm critical of some of the US funding efforts. It needs to happen, it needs to increase. It's not necessarily making it to these volunteer fighters, but it has been spent well and reforming that army, and then NATO and the US has spent a lot of time training troops, and that makes a huge difference. Yeah. Anybody else?
I have a follow-up.
Oh, yeah.
Me, sorry.
Okay.
I've
Yes, sir.
also read that basically Putin produced 900,000 veterans in the Donbas region without knowing it, and now they're active across the country.
Yeah. And everybody says, well, how could Putin not know this stuff, right? Like, and we know that his leadership did not tell him. There's something else too, though. What Putin should have known, and what the FSB does and the KGB before it, is they professionally lie, not only on missions and stuff, but to their supervisors. And Putin should have remembered that that's what he used to do as well. But it's a matter of arrogance and an inferiority complex, maybe even some health issues. Keith? This is my literature professor, Keith Morris,
Talk pretty loud.
also a mentor.
I need this thing. So I guess I have a question. We were talking it last night. I'd really be interested in hearing you talk some about how social media and media in general, all the changes since the last time we had, faced this kind of war, has affected the way that the war is being fought, because I know that that's a big topic and that you saw some of that for sure. And also, as we were talking last night about how do you go about eroding Putin's support within its own country and how important that is. I was reading, I think it was in the Times or the Post this morning, about how estimates are now that Russia's lost 20,000 troops, 20,000 dead Russian soldiers in Ukraine, and yet only about 1,000 of them have been reported within the country. And there's this effort going on to hide, as you mentioned, sort of hide those fatalities, and orders that are actually going out to the families who have lost children not to talk about it, right, publicly. And they're being so the mothers and fathers of the dead Russian soldiers are being threatened by the state if they divulge what's happening. So given all that, given the power of media now and social media, I guess my question in a way is, how does Putin keep that? How does he manage to keep a sort of a stranglehold on information within the state so that he can continue to keep people as misinformed as they are?
That is the question. That is the million-dollar question. I guess my answer is that he won't. Eventually, the truth will come out. The question is, will it come out in time to save Ukrainian civilians? That's what we don't know. It's interesting you point out 20,000 dead Russian soldiers. That's more than Iraq or Afghanistan. And this has been 1 month of fighting, 6 weeks, maybe 8. There's another thing about that figure. So we were told leading up to the war that 200,000 Russian troops were surrounding the border. It's true, but that number is deceiving because there are 30,000 Belarusian troops. Putin is going to send in Wagner, which is a private military corporation, and they're incredibly ruthless. They are, as many people know, recruiting soldiers in Syria. Putin will not send in those 30,000 Belarusian troops. Last year, Belarus almost got rid of its dictator, almost overthrew them. When a Belarusian MiG forced a civilian aircraft to land so they could arrest a journalist and his girlfriend, should have woken people up. But the truth is that the Belarusian people and forces are so disillusioned. It won't just be people sabotaging tanks, as we've seen. They may turn around and kill their commanders. So you take out 30,000. There are about 10,000 Chechen troops fighting for Russia and maybe 1,000 fighting for Ukraine. Everyone knows the Chechens are brutal, but they don't know. They're not able to, let's say, communicate, follow orders, and take part in grander escalation. So in many ways, aside from killing civilians, they're not effective. So take them out too. And then you've got all this ordnance. We've seen so many tanks that have been blown up. And for every tank that you've seen, it also tells a story of lost manpower. It's been wasted. About 4 people for every one of those tanks. This stuff adds up. 20,000 troops is a ton. That's half of Russia's military forces gone. If we add all up, the Belarusians, the Chechens, those who are not effective, those who deserted. So, and those are just the ones who are dead. So it is remarkable that in a matter of 6 weeks, the Ukrainians have been able to eliminate half the Russian army. No one thought that was possible. It still doesn't seem possible. But I think that's a big indication. And as you ask, what happens at home? Everybody wants Putin to be assassinated. My uncle says, Will, we should send in James Bond to get him. And there's this idea. The thing is that if the US were to do that, it would not be pretty because Putin already sees himself as a victim. Same way Trump claimed he was a victim, but Putin sees himself as a victim while trying to eliminate an entire country and its people. If he's killed, he'll be martyred. And all these people who are on the fence, who are starting to realize these troops are dying, they'll suddenly be pushed back. And someone worse will replace Putin. The Russian people are going to have to do this themselves. They're going to have to kill him. They're going to have to overthrow him. Again, will this happen in time to save Ukrainian civilians? I do not know. I hope. As Doc pointed out to me a few weeks ago, I'm teaching a workshop in Georgia for journalism. And one of the things I had them read was a Thomas Friedman, where he calls it World War Wired. Because this is the first conflict of this scale where we've had social media present. What does that mean? Well, Ukraine has fought a brilliant information war. It is absolutely remarkable. The Georgians did this pretty well in 2008, but Russian cyber war, let's say, made that less effective. But we haven't seen a lot of cyber attacks right now in Russia. They are not prepared. So what does this mean? What I like to say is it means that everybody here can make a difference. You're on social media too. You have a voice. You can share the photo I just showed. Every little piece of information out there whittles away at Putin's authority, at his power. Again, the truth will surface. A lot of people in Russia are in a state of denial. Ukrainian, and there's so many Ukrainians who have relatives in Russia and vice versa. Ukrainians are calling home and saying, hey, this is happening. And in Russia, the Russians will say, no, it's not. They're wrong. It's not. And they say, well, I see it out my window right now. And they say, no. There's denial going on. Because if you start to admit just a little bit, if you say, well, okay, one thing's true, then maybe all those things are true, and the truth just comes flooding in. It is easier to remain in a state of denial, because that's a lot to admit. But if one thing gets through, then it all comes crumbling down. So I find hope in the fact that we all have access to social media. Yes, a lot of it's not getting there, but we will find a way. We all have to keep chipping away at this, and that's why it's so important to have these discussions, to talk about the truth and share it on social media. Any other questions?
Yeah, thanks, Will. I don't know if you can hear or see me. This is a brave new world. Thanks so much for being here, Will. And I'm sorry I can't be there in person, but I'm quarantining. I have a question from Pauline Detholazeni. And also, if there's time, I have a question of my own. So Pauline is wondering, Dr. Detholazeni from the Languages Department, who thanks you for the talk and is wondering about the Donbas region and the people there who want independence, and who that group is, what proportion of that, what percentage of people want independence and why. I know we saw the Donbas film earlier, so as part of the series, this series of events at Clemson. So if you could say a few words about the Donbas region, that would be great.
It's quite remarkable what's happened in Donbas. Odessa, on the absolute other side, used to have what they called a pro-Russian mayor. When this war broke out, he has become the very opposite of that. He is criticizing Putin. So many people in eastern Ukraine have seen the worst of this war. And that has created a lot of support for Ukraine. People who would have never supported Ukraine are now doing it. Russia's tactic is to basically first, it's divide and conquer. So they're breaking off these areas. They'll hold a referendum, fake referendum, and try to bring these places in. They're doing it in Georgia too. By watching Georgia, we can understand where this is headed. 20% of Georgia is occupied. There's a small breakaway territory called South Ossetia. And the leaders there's an election coming up in 2 days. They're all they're all running on a platform of make South Ossetia join Russia, let it be annexed. They're terrified because when this war fails, it is failing. When Putin is gone, they're afraid Georgia is going to try to take those territories back. I get it to an extent. But so what Russia's doing is it creates these breakaway territories, fuels ethnic tensions, performs ethnic cleansing, as we've seen in Georgia. It's happening even right now in Ukraine. We can't even get into Mariupol to see, but we know so many people have been forced to head east, and many people have wanted to as well. So I think this war has, in the East, created remarkable support for Ukraine that, again, never would have happened. But it also makes these little governments, in charge of these little micro nations, breakaway territories that are supported by Russia. And make no mistake, the troops there, those are FSB agents. The FSB is in charge of the external border in Russia, and it has an entire unit where they just send in FSB agents to look like Russian-backed separatists and to fight. It's that way in Georgia as well. So Donbas is a tricky place, but I think it's quite remarkable in the support for the Ukrainians that has been created by this war. Does that answer your question?
It does, or I think I'm speaking with Pauline. The question that I had is things that I've seen on the internet, which may, to some degree may or may not be accurate, which is this morning I saw TikToks of wealthy Russian women cutting up their Coach handbags with garden shears to protest Coach's decision to close its stores in Russia. I've also heard that the majority of the rank and file Russian soldiers did not grow up in homes with running water, in terms of the rural nature of that. And I mean, I know we sure have problems with income inequality here in the United States of our own, but I'm sort of curious. It seems like a country of oligarchs and people crapping in holes seems like a difficult national. It seems like it's hard to imagine that as a cohesive national unit. So I'm just curious what kind of role you see that sort of huge social inequality in Russia playing in this conflict.
I mean, that's how Putin has been able to get almost 200,000 soldiers at all, is because many of these soldiers are from poor families. They are not educated. They're young too. They're very young, and they're just taking orders. What we've seen from the Russians who have been captured, who, of course, there are people violating the Geneva Conventions who are there, hurting some of those. But Zelensky's policy has been, if someone surrenders or is captured, they will not be hurt. They will even be given asylum, which is a brilliant statement to make. And it seems that's being true. And so when you look at the messages of those captives, it's quite remarkable what they say. And again, it's, they thought they were coming to fight Nazis. They bought into it. It's also a little bit of denial. Again, they're very actively denying a reality they sense is true, but it's much easier to tell yourself one thing. So, yeah, it's a system that won't last. It's just a matter of how quickly it'll fall apart.
Great.
And on that note, I think we've reached nearly 12:30, and we've put you through your paces, vice versa as well. Thanks very much, and thanks to everyone for being here.
Thanks, everybody. Sure is a pleasure. Thank you. Great to see you. It's good to be here. Yeah. Okay.